I'm Matthew Tolliver. I'm a psychologist and director of behavioral health at East Tennessee State University in their Department of Pediatrics. And Chus and I are co-chairing the Peds SIG this year. And so, you know, we're so excited to have you, and we love that you're here. And part of what we're doing this year is trying to coordinate our efforts around a theme. And that theme is to respond to the pediatric mental health crisis that's going on. And the Surgeon General put out kind of an advisory about that late last year. And so we wanted to see how can we work together to, you know, make some headway around that. And so each of our meetings this year is going to be focused on an aspect of that theme to some extent. And so we've got a couple things that we do each time that we meet that are kind of some standard things. So Chus will go through an example of how she's doing an aspect of integrated care at her site. And then we'll have a research corner and then a facilitated discussion. And we usually have some or all of those components at each of our meetings, but we're really casual, we're relaxed. Feel free to, you know, interject. We want it to be discussion based. We want it to be something that you're hopefully getting something out of. And if you've got ideas for the future, we'd love to have you present at one of these categories. Or if you're wondering about a question to something, you can bring it to the group. And so I've been a part of this group for a couple of years now, and it's just a great place to get professional consultation, to make friendships, to network. And so one of the things that we're doing is trying to have a few things that we might be able to take from this SIG and go out to the larger CFHA community. So things like if you're interested in being a part of a podcast, for example, the CFHA podcast, and helping address the pediatric mental health crisis, we might form a team to do that within CFHA. If you're interested, another team within our SIG might be working on a position statement that CFHA could put out, just advertising and bringing awareness to the pediatric mental health crisis. And so there's some other projects that are going. If you've got specific ideas that you think would work well for that, we'd love to hear your ideas. And if you feel like you've got the time and the energy and the excitement to be on one of those teams that might actually meet a little bit outside of our monthly meeting to work on one of these tangible outcomes, then feel free to, you know, shoot your email to me in the chat, and I can put my email and we can connect and make sure that you've got some opportunities to collaborate even above and beyond the monthly meeting that we're having. So with that, I will hand it over to Chus and we will get started.
Hey, hi everyone. So I have Dan Rob here with me. He has my same role in another region of the PPOC. We are both integration managers, which means we cover a bunch of practices in the region that we are assigned to help them integrate behavioral health. And him and I work together in trauma-informed care training for our practices to start introducing the concept to the pediatric teams. So what we are going to go over today is just a mini version of that, focusing on the topic for today, which is on the screening or not screening and discussion associated to that. So I'm going to share the screen for sharing the slides that we have for this. I think that's it. So we approach this from the primary, secondary, and tertiary prevention levels. We are not going to touch on the third one because it's when kids are already exhibiting symptoms of trauma. We are going to just touch on the primary prevention and the secondary prevention for the purpose of screening and discussion. So what we talked to our pediatric teams about was introducing the concept of primary prevention of trauma, with universal approaches that are applied to all children. So this is for all the population of children in the practice, to decrease risk of exposure to potentially traumatic events, and increase the protective factors to buffer the response to those events. So what we recommended was routinely assess the family assets and risks. And we here start with making the families feel comfortable in the practice, obviously, and then provide a space for discussion. So we mentioned the use of a screener or having a discussion of both the stressors and the strengths. Make these discussions brief is a very important point because pediatricians always complain that we're trying to tell them do more things in the same time available. Ask patients about their overall well-being, and some tips about what we mean by strengths. That can be personal things like a supportive family or successes that the kid has in school or at work if it's a young adult. As for stressors, they could include conversations about vulnerabilities like lack of economic resources, confidence in parenting skills, and so on. So we gave them a list of risk factors and protective factors so they could dive into those conversations. And then we discuss how to routinely assess the parent-child interaction, which actually is something that all the pediatricians already do, right? I don't know what your practices have in terms of tools for this, but one thing that our pediatric practices have is the SIG. So that instrument has family questions about some of these factors. So it's a good way to initiate the conversations, and it's already that they have already built into the EPIC system. So we are not telling them to do things that are new and complicated. It's just paying attention on where is the connection between the ACEs and positive experiences with what they already do. Then we also have a health needs assessment that is done at every well-child visits where social determinants of health are explored. And this is, again, common practice for our practices. So we can share the health needs assessment if anyone is interested in taking a look at it. And then something more recent that we have incorporated into EPIC is, in the visit, is the question of what matters to you, which includes sharing the most important questions or concerns to discuss in the visit, the goals for the child or the youth health, and sharing important updates. So then we also recommended thinking, okay, aside from these instruments, maybe you want to add specific questions about strengths and ask directly about those in the visit. And as for the trauma screen per se, our recommendation was to consider verbal trauma screen. We did not recommend utilizing a screening instrument. And the question that was recommended is the question that is here in the slide. Since our last visit, has anything scary happened? Oops. Oh, yeah, sorry. Or upsetting happened to you or your family. So this is where we are at in terms of what we are orienting the practices to do. So reflections on why are we doing this and what are the tips that could be helpful for them. Well, the goal is to promote the dialogue about the circumstances that impact health and well-being, and develop processes to administer or introduce screeners if that's the case. Some practices actually are talking about introducing specific screeners. And for the existing ones, just emphasize that all the things that help normalize that we are screening for a reason, and this pertains to everyone in the practice, and the responses are confidential, and also it is optional. Then in the follow-up conversations, acknowledge the completion of the screeners. We always emphasize this in our learning communities, that they are busy, they move on fast, and we want to make sure that every kid gets reinforced for even completing or a family. And a collaborative planning to address the concerns, and agreement to check in again if there is no concerns at the present time. Dan, do you want to do the secondary?
Sure. So we talked a bit about secondary prevention and intervention. So if there's known exposure to a potential traumatic experience. So the next slide, we define that as specific screenings or interventions to try and detect issues from the earliest stage possible, and really trying to target around special populations at high risk for potential traumatic exposure and those with known or history of traumatic exposure. So we really tried to focus on the use of language and having these perhaps more in-depth conversations and assessments and interventions. So emphasizing with providers this change language from what's wrong with you based on whatever symptoms are presenting to the questions we see here. What happened to you? What is strong with you and can provide resilience, and asking families who supports you and your child. So to try and pull together resources within the medical home, within the primary care space, within the community as well. And emphasizing ways to normalize potential reactions and instilling hope. A few of the pointers that we're continuing to promote with our practices is making those links between adversity, health, and child development in a way that's understandable and approachable for families, and doing our best to avoid blaming language or judgmental language. Really prioritizing the family's perspective on what's happening and how this is impacting their well-being and their child's well-being. This idea of normalizing experiences that there can be perhaps expected or typical physical emotional reactions to these really stressful events, and that indeed there can be things that can be done to help. And again, to be grounded in resilience and strengths, and that this is truly a way to buffer these negative experiences. So trying to increase provider language and understanding of these things. And finally, I'm sure everyone's familiar with ACEs, but sharing out this research around positive childhood experiences, or PCEs, that have kind of a similar inverse effect of ACEs. I'm trying to kind of get this type of information out to providers as well to incorporate into their own care, and also to share it out to families. So that's a bit about what we're doing in the PPOC to support our primary care practices.
That's great. Thank you all so much. Do you want to say just maybe 30 seconds on your organization and how it functions and where you are, and so people can kind of understand, I guess, the context of the types of clinics that you might be running that in?
So we are an organization that is, I think, more than 50 pediatric practices have integrated behavioral health. These are independently owned practices affiliated to Boston Children's Hospitals. And what the PPOC does is consult for these practices in regards to integrated care and provide educational opportunities as well as consultation for the behavioral health clinicians embedded in the practice. So we kind of give, the educational portion, the operational, and also the clinical support. Since we have such a big number of practices, we have the organization divided in regions. So where I'm the West region in Massachusetts, Dan is the Metro West, and we also have a North and South region. So each of us has a bunch of practices from each of the regions and collaborate with other members of the organization, such as our quality team, a safety team, regional support team that is a team of community health workers that support the practices in social determinants of health, but also with management of conditions such as asthma, educating the families and supporting them, advocate, and so on. So I think I'm not missing any aspect, but Dan, maybe if I am, you cannot.
Sounds good to me, Chris.
Right. Questions, what reactions or questions or comments do folks have based on hearing that? The whole theme of today is, around ACEs and resilience. And so you got a snapshot of how one practice or organization is addressing that. And then we'll hear a research corner on the same topic, but just so far, any questions for that team or reactions to the presentation?
I had a question about the positive childhood experiences, because I really like this framing, and it sounds like it kind of comes up in terms of a discussion of resiliency and strengths. And I guess I was just curious if there are screening measures that you use or would recommend, or were you simply saying, we encourage this discussion with the families?
We don't have an instrument for that. We just have, we encourage them to incorporate it into the discussion. And also, we are kind of trying to do a more patient-centered approach with those other questions about what people want to bring up and so on. But we don't have any screen. And actually, I don't know if there are any. So if someone here knows more about it, it would be great to know if that could be incorporated.
Yeah, I was curious because I hadn't heard of an actual kind of screener to use.
I was wondering, for the health needs assessment, it sounds like that's what the name was that was addressing the social determinants of health. Is that right? Mm-hmm. Is that something you all figured out how to get reimbursed for, or how long is that, and who administers it?
It's not long. It's actually pretty short. The medical home care coordinators do that piece, and they connect with the families if there is a concern in there. So it's not typically the behavioral health clinicians, and we are not billing for that.
So they do that at the time of the primary care appointment? Yes.
So this is part of what we send for the well child visit. So there is the behavioral health screenings, that is either the SIG or the PSC, and this health needs assessment at every well child. But the portion of the visit with this health needs assessment is done by the care coordinator.
So it's done in person to person, or is it like they endorse a need and then somebody calls them later?
Yeah, no, it could be depending on the situation. They could be doing a one handoff, they could be completing it via my chart and then address at the visit. So it depends on how the families want to complete it.
That's great. Yeah, we're trying to do something similar where we have a social determinants of health screener, and then since we're in this academic health science center setting, we have social work students who then try to do warm handoffs and intervene around that, kind of in the moment too, to address those concerns. So that's great. We just haven't figured out how to totally bill for it yet. But what is that health needs assessment something that you guys are getting paid for then, you said?
No, but so when there is a complex care patient, then the medical home care coordinators can bill for the care plans that they develop with them. So just with the form only, we don't. But if the case gets to the level of the care management, then there is a care management billing associated to it. But it obviously has to be connected with the health condition. which a lot of times it is because this team works a lot with the asthma diagnosis. So.
Other questions or comments?
Thank you. I appreciate that. I know one of the things that we were kicking around using was and I'm sorry, I missed your presentation, so it might have been in there. But the benevolent childhood events screener, which is kind of like a mirror of the ACEs. It's like 10 items. Has this occurred? Yes or no, as a way of kind of assessing and screening for protective factors. And this is something that's that I'm really interested too, because and maybe we already got into this or we'll get into this, but you know, ACEs are things that already happened, and it's important to identify risk, but it could also change expectations for a kid when we know that actually the majority of kids who experience ACEs are fine, but they are at higher risk for developing some of these other outcomes, and they're not as modifiable. So, you know, in a perfect world, I'd love to do like a horse race or like a head-to-head comparison of which one is more predictive, protective factors or risk factors of future problems and success. Because things like benevolent childhood effects or events are modifiable, right? There are things that we can build, and we don't have to wait for them to happen to put those things in place. And so I love this conversation because I think it's a balance of both. In a perfect world, we'd have information on both of those things. But I'm struggling to find kind of a benevolent childhood experiences or resilience measure that I feel like fully encapsulates what the resilience literature shows to be protective. And so we haven't really found a measure that's either brief enough or comprehensive enough of all the kind of Big 10 resilience factors that we feel confident in moving forward with.
Cody, do you have, how would you envision somebody intervening around that type of screener, you know, based on whether you endorse a lot or a little of protective factors? Do you see it as then just another way to open the conversation about it, try to find practical, like behavioral change ways of promoting the things that are listed on there, that kind of thing?
Yeah, exactly right. So thinking about the ideas of kind of building a resilient structure around each and every kid that we see, whether they've experienced ACEs or not, just knowing that trauma-informed care tells us that many folks will experience some trauma or adverse experiences at some point in their life. And so rather than waiting for intervention to say, okay, now this person's experienced risk, what can we do to resolve that risk or to report that risk? But more of saying like, you know, positive relationship with an adult, having a strong friend network, being involved in extracurricular activities, being good at problem solving, being able to persist in activities when they get hard. All of these things are predictors of a kid responding strongly to when they experience risk or adverse. And we could be screening for those things early and often and building those things that they aren't endorsing. So helping them explore adults in their life who maybe they haven't thought about, a coach or somebody, a teacher at school, if that item isn't flagged, that they feel like they have a supportive adult in their life, or if they feel like they're struggling with social skills, putting them in a social skills group and building those skills prior to an event happening.
That's great. And as a BHC, I kind of think about, you know, it gives a direction for framing some of those behavioral parent training interventions even too early on. That's great. It looks like Angela was saying there's a measure called the Protective and Compensatory Factor Screener. It was created by Amanda Morris. She's now at Oklahoma State University. I've used it with children and published on it with service members. Great. Do you want to say anything more about that, Angela?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, sorry about that. My docking station does not like my speakers.
No problem.
I actually found this as a part of a project that we were doing with service members and veterans, because we were really interested in trying to look at not only adverse childhood experiences, but also adverse adult experiences or adverse life experiences. And so we began to use it. It was really fascinating because we did find, to your question, Cody, it was really interesting to see how those individuals who had higher protective and compensatory factors were less likely to have adverse life experiences as adults. And so we began to implement that then with our, we have a school of children from kindergarten through 5th grade. And we do not ask the children these ACEs questions, but we do ask the parents or guardians for their own ACE experiences, as well as they report for the ACE experiences of the children. And we also ask about those protective, we use the PACEs for them as well, both in their own life and for their children. And it has actually been really helpful as an aggregate for the school, because they have been able to employ more protective factors in the school system based on those metrics. Our children have very high ACE scores. They're in a very underserved community. And so we have not been able to use this as much in the primary care settings that we have been using. Of course, it's in our mind all the time, but we don't use like a find your score in that system. However, we do have EMDR trained therapists that are part of our integrated care team. And so we have been able to provide some resources in our primary care system for those that really do need that service. So I don't know if that is helpful at all.
That's so helpful. That's great. And it looked like Cody posted that benevolent childhood event screener, which, as I was looking through that, it's just really practical stuff, right? Like, and it is modifiable, so that I could see a lot of value. We haven't used that, but I could see a lot of value in that. Why don't we turn it over to Rachel, and she can kind of keep the theme going and talk. What we usually do for the research corner is she so graciously picks an article and, preps a little presentation for it for us. And so I'll turn it over to her, and we'll keep the conversation in that same theme going.
Thanks, Matt. I'm going to share my screen here and get the PowerPoint up. This is really exciting stuff to kind of hear what people are thinking. And I think the larger theme of this discussion is going above and beyond. Oh, let me get this play from start here. There we go. Just screening, but how to improve upon screening, and then what do you do with that? And that's kind of part of this article that I'm going to present. And so this is going back to adverse childhood experiences. And this research team was interested in providing a conversation as opposed to simply doing a screening. As we discuss, sometimes you can ask the questions, and then what do you do with that information? And so they chose to kind of pilot more of a conversation and a discussion, more within the lens of this kind of primary prevention that Chus and Dan were kind of talking about. And so this is basically an overview of the conversation that they developed, and then patient provider experiences of that conversation. So these conversations happened within the context of every wellness visit in primary care. So it was an anticipatory guidance type of intervention. And afterwards, they asked providers and patients, what did they think about it? Were they interested in the conversation? Was it a positive conversation, et cetera? And they also surveyed providers across time just to see how things were going, and also to get a sense of, what are the barriers, what are the facilitators to implementing this conversation within the visits. So to describe the ACE conversation, it really was more focused on psychoeducation and preliminary resources, essentially. So describing the impact of adversity and toxic stress on a child's current health and future functioning. But the main thing here, as I mentioned before, is that they do not screen for ACEs within this conversation, and they didn't ask for parents to disclose a history, although you could imagine that could potentially come up as you start to have this conversation with families. They implemented every well child visit. Again, this is kind of that anticipatory guidance piece. And they had a card that helped really facilitate the discussion. So I'll show that on the next slide here. So on the left side, this is the top of the card, and this is more of the psychoeducation portion of the ACE conversation. How frequently it affects families, 7 out of 10 families. What are examples of ACEs, abuse, neglect, substance abuse, mental illness, et cetera, parents. And that it increases risk, of course, of these health problems now and down the line. And then the bottom part is a discussion piece about protecting children, what you can do now. If you notice changes in your child, what can you do? Can you talk to somebody about it? It gives some general kind of prevention interventions or prevention strategies. So having a, keeping a routine and, quality family time, things like that. And then essentially, if you think that you need more help, especially as a parent, that there are options for you. And they provide some examples of resources, I imagine, that are within the kind of the area, local resources for parents. So this, it's not clear to me, and I think that there may not have had behavioral health on staff potentially. So this is all done by primary care providers, medical providers. So in terms of results from the patient's perspective, most felt that this conversation was positive. None reported that it was negative, although a quarter reported it as neutral. Most felt comfortable with the conversation. Over half were interested. Again, 41%, about 40% were neutral, perhaps makes sense in terms of anticipatory guidance, and maybe this doesn't, maybe it's less relevant for certain families. But in a positive spin, of course, that everyone, most people wanted to hear this from their primary care clinician. So overwhelmingly positive, comfortable kind of conversation. In terms of providers, what they reported, the majority of conversations took about 1 to 2 minutes. And of course, time is super important in terms of all the demands placed. So that it could be brief is a good sign, although for some providers, they did report it took a little bit longer. They generally felt prepared, they're comfortable, they thought it was important. So there's buy-in regarding the conversation, and most felt that it went positively. In terms of asking about challenges and benefits from the provider perspective of having this conversation, some providers did note that they thought caregivers maybe felt accused or took offense to the conversation, even though, again, this is meant to be universal and everybody has it. It's not meant to say that a parent is doing something wrong. They felt that sometimes parents perhaps interpreted the conversation in that way. Hard to figure out when you bring this up, when's the best timing in the wellness visit. And they also reported wanting to have more resources to provide to parents, in addition to some of the resources they had for families there. But again, they think that the benefits outweighed the challenges, that most caregivers were receptive. There was an increased awareness about ACEs. The card was really helpful in guiding the discussion with families. So in conclusion with this study, they found that the ACE conversation is acceptable and feasible, and they really frame it as something that can complement screening. If you do screening in ACEs, that you want to have kind of a workable and appropriate conversation about that, or as an alternative method that you don't have to directly ask families, but if you're viewing this as, again, primary universal prevention, that you can have this discussion with everyone. And certainly there may be opportunities for parents to disclose things that have happened, or children to disclose things that have happened that you can kind of work with if needed. And I think this is, again, maybe opening up, hopefully, the conversation for everyone to jump in about how you handle ACEs. And now that we're starting to talk about positive childhood experiences as well, thinking about how you handle these screenings or conversations, and the benefit perhaps of framing this as anticipatory guidance. And here is, of course, the reference for you all. I'm going to stop my share and open it back up to the group.
Thank you so much. That was great. Do you know if there was a piece of any education for the providers in order to prepare them for this psychoeducation conversation, just in case.
Yeah, I know that seems important. I'd have to look back at the article to see how they trained. I don't remember, but you certainly probably don't want to throw them in with the card and say, have at it. I'll have to take a look.
I think that's so interesting. And, you know, I think they frame it as a complementary thing, but to me, it almost seems like a vital, essential component if you're going to do any kind of ACEs screening, because, you know, equipping the providers or the nursing staff or even the front desk with some sample language of how to introduce it, I think it makes it a little bit more normalized and makes it work. And we're not screening on a universal level right now for ACEs, but we had a grant a couple of years ago where we did, and we actually like wrote up some little sample scripts that the physicians could use that had sample language for introducing it, and then people kind of took it and made it their own, but it had, you know, like the talking points basically, which kind of sounds like what that article was showing. And then I was just going to share one thing that, like an example, I think that kind of merges the ACEs and the protective factors. We kind of developed this little one-pager front and back that talked about, that would be handed out along with the screener, and then the physician would come in and use this to start the conversation too. So it talked a little bit about ACEs, and then on the back it had 5 protective factors that were a little bit more concrete things, you know, that you could do from now on, right, to try to promote resilience in your kid. And then we had some like local regional resources, hang on, that's good, that people could get connected with related to traumatic stress and things like that. So that was just one kind of example of how we had tried to do that.
Hey, Matt, can you share that?
Yeah, we could send that out as an example, maybe along with the article and during it for the minutes, if that would be helpful. And maybe we could send out Cody's protective factor screener as well, so people could have a copy of that.
And Angela was mentioning that what Cody sent is very similar to the PACEs. Angela, can you send us a link or direct us to where that lives? And what are the rest of you doing about this? I mean, are you having these conversations with your practices? Is anyone has implemented any of the screens or any of the tips about how to go about these conversations? Even if you haven't, would you like to do that? Is that something that sounds like something that we should be doing?
Well, I can share something.
Hi, Marta.
Hello, hi. I'm Marta Rodriguez. I work in Valley Medical Group in Massachusetts. Right now, I'm in Amherst, Massachusetts. And so I really was looking for something like this. In our practice, we have 4 sites, and in some sites, we have more pediatric patients. In others are mostly adults. But so the reason why I'm here is because very much is about building a little bit more the BHC role into pediatrics. And one of the things that I had been noticed working with some patients, pediatric consults that comes to my way, is that some of them may have some screening tools. Most of them may not have any screening tools. So the practice is not consistent across the sites and across the PCPs. So I don't know, just listening today, I'm aware of the ACE. I really glad to hear about other tools that are more focused on resilience and positive experiences. That's a new one for me. But I just wonder, like, in my role where I am, it's about starting giving some shape, guidance to the PCPs about, hey, these are some screening tools that we could start given to our patients, just, to see not only working with what is going on, but also to work with prevention and also build on resilience, right? So I just wonder, listening to all of this, I just wonder, what would be helpful in terms of like a, nice package, at least for wellness visit for pediatric, to have as an anchor.
Thank you, Marta. That's, I don't know again what the rest of you are thinking, but this has been the ongoing conversation around our practices, like shouldn't we, and how to do it. But to Rachel's comment now that in this article that is wonderful, we really don't know how they did the educational piece for the providers. But when we did this presentation for our practices, we obviously embedded this in the trauma-informed care conversations. So we started with the paying attention to the environment, all the roles, having some type of education on how to respond to patients. And this is just like a minor piece compared to the whole endeavor that they have to embark on in order to create the spaces where people feel this dialogue can happen or this screen can be implemented. So does any of you have ideas about that, or would you like to share something connected to the whole project, even if it's not screening or asking or having the conversation?
I'm wondering if anybody knows of any work around like equity issues in ACEs. It's one of the things that I think about a lot. It's like the folks who I think get underestimated or who receive a lot of implicit bias and explicit bias are also the ones who are most likely to experience ACEs. And I wonder if patient demographics or family demographics, the extent to which that affects the way that a provider, a nurse, a teacher would interpret the ACEs or make assumptions about how that ACE affects a person's prognosis, for example. Like the original ACEs study was predominantly white, predominantly wealthy folks, and they found that it had significant impacts. It was significantly prevalent. But I worry, we know through education studies, the impact of a teacher's expectations of a kid is one of the most predictive factors on their educational success. It changes how the teacher interacts with that kid. It changes how that kid interacts in the class. Just thinking back to those old early studies where they kind of gave that fake ability test to a bunch of kids and then told the teachers, this kid's expected to do really well, this kid's not expected to do well. And it completely changed the way the teacher taught. And it was actually not the kid's true ability. It was whether that kid was identified as a kid with ability or not having ability. That was the most positive predictor of their success moving forward. So one of the things that always rattles on the back of my mind is that kind of intersection of expectation and whether expectations change more dramatically or less dramatically depending on patient characteristics once they identify that this child has had an or multiple ACEs. I don't know if anybody's aware of any work around that. Or if maybe I'm just like way off base and that is something I shouldn't be worried about. But
no, I think you're on base. I pulled some papers on this for a teaching session last year with our residents, and I think the specific paper I'll try to track down the site was like thinking about like how that ACE, that kind of standard ACE scale performed with like a more kind of diverse population. And I remember that like one of the conclusions was that that when you added kind of items that better captured stressors outside of the household, so in terms of peer relationships, school experiences, community violence, that kind of was like a better accounting of the people's experiences in terms of the stressors that they had. So I think it broadened it a little bit from just like the household focus. I'll send that paper if I can find it.
Yes, please. I was also thinking on that line about when the practices or the clinics match or don't match the population they serve in terms of culture and language and all that. Because this, when Rachel was mentioning the discomfort of some families, I'm curious to know, in connection with what Cody was saying, what families were those? Probably the families who have experienced the ACEs are the ones that are uncomfortable with the conversation. But also, it depends on who is asking or who is bringing it up. If they feel unsafe, if there is not a match in terms of who they are. So
I'll just throw a couple of things out there to think about. One was that when we screened for ACEs, we moved to a model where the families were not indicating which items they were screening positive to, but just as a total score. And I do think that helps in terms of, especially with families maybe who you haven't built a relationship with yet, and being able to help them feel a little bit safer about, not discussing specifics if they're not at that point yet. And then the other thought that I have, I don't know if people have used the PEARLs before. That's the Nadine Burke-Harris and the Center for Youth Wellness out in California. And it's sort of, I think it's pediatric ACEs and related life events or something to that. That's what the PEARLs acronym is, but it sort of merges adverse childhood experiences and environments that kids are currently living in to sort of try to tap both of those things that maybe have happened in the past, and also environments and factors that they are currently experiencing. So we have found that to be a helpful tool as well.
thank you, Lisa.
Yeah, that total score was huge for us too around mandated reporting. We were really worried that we were going to identify a bunch of things that we'd have to do safety assessments and mandated reporting for, which is likely to only further distrust of the screening process. And so that total score allowed us to allow the family to opt out of reporting any specifics until they were ready.
Yeah, same for us. I think that tends to work pretty well.
Okay, guys. So do you think we should be working on best practices for this topic? I would love to, but I cannot do it alone.
And we were thinking even this year, these monthly sessions are a little bit of an extended conversation and practice and vetting for a pre-conference workshop or ELO that our SIG is trying to put on the CFHA conference this year. So I think this is great conversation around all of those things, and really, I think, helps us as a SIG to think about how we would want to frame and build on this content at the conference.
Well, thank you for sharing the paper, Joy. So Matt, I don't know if you want to say a little bit more on how this could take shape if we work together for this piece for the conference, or how people can contribute. Can you elaborate a little bit?
Yeah, so I just put my email in the chat, and if folks are interested, we always just want people to be able to show up for these SIG meetings, and whenever I do, I always get some new thing out of it that I had never thought about before, or whether it's a screener or an idea or something I want to try to take back to my practice, that I really find it practically helpful. So I think one level this year of participation within the SIG is just to show up to meetings and hear those cool ideas and things that come up. Another level of participation would be letting us know if you have the time and willingness to, not in your mouth. My wife and son have COVID, so we're all like home quarantining. Being able to do that, this is how we do it, kind of the thing that Chus and Daniel did at the beginning. It's really just like a 5 or 6 minute little blurb about here's how we do an aspect of integrated care at our site. and then kind of having a discussion like we did from that. If you have ideas for a research corner, you know, we could, if you've got a certain paper that you think would be good, send it our way. Or if you feel like there's a discussion topic that we would want to facilitate and would be good for the whole group, we'd love to have you be a part of that. And then beyond that, you know, we have a leadership team that meets apart from this meeting every month to think through how can we plan for this meeting, and what are other ways that we can leverage the SIG. And so if you want to help and participate on some side projects as well, shoot me an email and I'm happy to get folks connected to like-minded folks. For example, if they wanted to work on, you know, a nice package or protocol or resource list for ACEs and resilience and protective factor screening that we could bring back to the SIG. And so I think for the pre-conference workshop or the ELO, it's the broad topic is how do we help with this pediatric mental health crisis, right? But there's a lot that goes into that. And I think this, the report that the Surgeon General put out, this is one of the pieces of what the Surgeon General was saying, ways that healthcare providers could address it is by addressing trauma-informed care and ACEs. So I think that's kind of where all of this links in for me. Other things that other folks wanted to say from the leadership team standpoint? I felt like this was a great discussion today, and it's great to see so many faces on the call. And, you know, apart from this particular topic, one of the goals of this group is for people just to network and get to know each other. And so, you know, if you've got other questions or concerns, feel free to put it out to our listserv. And when we send out the agenda, on the bottom of it is how you can post to the listserv. So you can email us directly, you can post your question on the listserv for the Peds SIG. And we're happy to, I think, try to answer it or connect you to people who are interested in the same topic. Anything else from you, Chus?
No, just I don't remember who put it in the chat, but just bring your teams along to the SIG.
Yes.
We'd love to be growing and hearing from more people. So yeah, anyone is welcome.
All right. Well, unless there's anything else, we'll let you get back to the rest of your afternoon, but I hope to see you all next month.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.